The following stories are used with permission from the book, The Big Book of Monsters, Volume 1, written by Josh Nanocchio. Link in description. Encounter 1, submitted by Orin, time 1992, location Oregon. In 1992, I used to go hunting with my brother all the time near Mount Hood National Forest. In fact, for many years we roughed it out there in the backcountry with minimal gear. I guess you could call it the survivalist in me. We would go for days at a time and never see another person. We were very familiar with the area, knew all the good spots to hunt, and had seen many strange things in our years of exploring. One night I was sleeping in my tent about 20 feet from my brother's tent. It was late fall, so it got real cold fast once the sun went down. I woke up around 2 a.m. to use the restroom. I always tried to go before bed. As soon as I stood up, something caught my eye that made me freeze mid-stride. About 50 yards away, standing next to a tree, was this massive hairy creature staring right back at me. The moonlight lit him up perfectly. He looked like he could have been 8 feet tall if he stood straight, but his posture seemed hunched over slightly, so maybe 6 feet. His arms hung way past his knees, and his head turned slowly from side to side, looking directly into my eyes and then back again as if sizing me up really good. Then he took off running on all fours super fast towards some thick forest brush or trees on top of a hill near us, which led into an old logging road area that no one used anymore. Reminded me of the way a gorilla runs on all fours when charging. I didn't know exactly what it was. Still, I knew it wasn't human or anything else known by man. After seeing him run away like that, I noticed how quiet everything became just seconds after seeing him, like every animal stopped moving all at once. It creeped me out big time. My heart felt like it would explode out of my chest. So naturally, being scared, I ran over, shaking uncontrollably, telling my brother, "Wake up, wake up, wake up." He sat upright, rubbing sleep from his eyes and asking, "What's wrong?" And that's when I told him what happened. He laughed, saying, "You're crazy." But I'm sure you can imagine how frustrated that made me feel. I finally got him to listen, so we both grabbed our flashlights and loaded rifles and walked outside together, shining lights everywhere, searching for any sign of movement anywhere. Only we saw nothing unusual except some deer grazing peacefully nearby, which surprised us because they are usually spooked easily by even slight noises. We decided to call off the search mission until morning light came, since neither one wanted to be alone outside. Once morning arrived, we scoured the entire area and found nothing unusual besides some tracks leading down the hillside through heavy brush areas, which elk or other large animals do travel during their nightly trips, but something tells me the thing I saw that night also used that game trail too. Encounter 2, submitted by Bradley. Time unknown, location Washington State. Call me crazy, but it's about time I share my story. I was 22 when this happened. I'm 40 now. This was outside the Seattle area when I was visiting a good friend, and we were going for a hike with my big brother, my cousin, and his friend. We were all young adults, 22 to 30 years old. We hiked up a trail about 3 miles long, with a river down below us on our left side and thick woods to our right side. I remember it was around noon when we started the hike, because I had just finished eating lunch with my friend's family before we went hiking. We had been walking for about an hour when my brother said he needed to stop for a minute to rest his leg from hurting him, since he had injured his knee the previous year. So we stopped in this small clearing by trees growing and weaving together. My brother sat down while my cousin and I stood there talking while waiting on my bro, who was sitting on the ground resting his leg as he complained of it hurting him pretty badly. I felt bad, but there was nothing we could do but allow him to rest. I figured I'd take the time to scout the clearing out and see if I could find any high vantage points near me for scenery. However, there were none. At least, not in this particular spot. We chatted a bit before deciding it was about time to move farther down the trail when I saw something moving through the nearby trees. It looked human-like but much larger and black. It moved like one solid mass, not gracefully at all. It sounds bizarre, but I thought there's a gorilla out here, but apes don't walk upright, do they? Its shoulders were far broader than mine are now, even though I'm 6 feet 1 inch tall, and its head seemed incredibly large. Then suddenly, whatever this thing is, stepped out into full view. Right next to where my brother was just sitting. I'll say I've never seen my brother move that fast in his life, even with his injured knee. Call me fortunate or unfortunate, but I believe that what I bore witness to was a living, breathing Sasquatch in the flesh. We saw it from head to toe in the light. It must have not liked our reaction to seeing it, because it let out this reckless scream that was almost blood-curdling but very deep. The hair on my body stood right up. The sound kind of reminds me of what lions sound like, only louder and deeper sounding. I think it was trying to intimidate us, but either way we didn't stick around. We took off running. We could hear this thing behind us throughout the trail beyond the trees. It was making this awful sounding breathing or huffing noise. I could hear it pounding its feet against the ground as it chased us. We made it back in record time to my friend's house. We were all out of breath and scared out of our minds. We told his family what had happened, and they were kind of skeptical. They said it was probably just a bear. I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear. It was the keeper of the forest, I called him. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, I know he's real. We all do now. Anyway, I've never been back to that area since. I don't think I'd ever want to. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. While it was fascinating and I'd love to see it again, I don't think I'd ever want to encounter it again. I'm not sure what it was going to do to us. I don't think it would hurt us, but I'm not sure. I think it was just trying to scare us off. I'm glad it did. I don't know what would have happened if it had caught us. I'm not sure if it would have eaten us or not. Submitted by Rick Shawford. Time 2000. Location Oregon. I was bow hunting for elk in the Umatilla National Forest near Pendleton. I was on a ridge that overlooked a large meadow. It was about 6:30 p.m. and I'd been sitting there for about an hour and a half when I heard something walking through the brush below me to my right, east. At first it sounded like two people walking together, but then it stopped moving and started making these strange grunting sounds. The sound of its breathing was hefty, so I turned on my headlamp and shined it down into the brush. I saw this giant hairy creature standing with its back facing me. It was about 9 feet tall and had reddish-brown hair all over its body. I could see that it had a massive chest and shoulders, but no neck. Its arms were extended. In reaction to the light, it turned to look in my direction, and that was when I saw its face for the first time. The face looked like a cross between an ape and a human. Flat nose, wide mouth with big teeth showing in the light from my headlamp. It stood there for several seconds, looking at me through his yellow eyes glowing. It seemed delirious or confused. Then it turned around slowly without making any noise or grunting sounds and quickly moved to the trees about 50 yards away. To be honest, I think I startled it. That was the impression I got from its reaction. With the light shining on its face, it didn't seem to know what to do or how to react. It walked upright like a man, but it was so tall that its head brushed the tops of the trees as it walked by them. I watched until I couldn't see it anymore. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a movie. I was terrified and amazed all at the same time. This creature was so big and hairy, and it looked nothing like any animal I had ever seen before. My jaw was on the floor. I couldn't believe I had just seen an actual Bigfoot. There was no other explanation that would have made sense. So after about 10 minutes, I got up and ran off the ridge toward my truck. I've been hunting and fishing in the woods all my life. I know what a bear looks like, and this wasn't one. I didn't tell anyone about this for several months because I thought they'd think I was crazy. But then someone else came forward with their own story about seeing something similar in the same area, so now I'm telling you, hiding it doesn't make sense anymore. This was no bear, and it wasn't a person in a costume. I know what I saw, and there's no denying it. There are Bigfoots out there in the wild. Oregon, well, the whole Pacific Northwest is Bigfoot territory. I'm not the only one who's seen one. There have been many reports of sightings in this area for years now. I'll admit that for the longest time I didn't buy into the idea of it. That was, of course, until I had this experience. I've got some relatives who are part of the Umatilla tribe down here, and boy, oh boy, do they have some pretty harrowing stories. They've been dealing with these creatures for generations. They have a name for them too, although I don't know it. I don't know much about their legends or folklore, but but I do know that they're not to be trifled with. Encounter 4, submitted by Gus L. Time, unknown. Location, Texas. I'm 44. I grew up in East Texas and currently reside in the state. I have been an avid outdoorsman all my life. I have spent countless hours in the woods of East Texas, both as a child hunting and fishing and as an adult hiking, camping and kayaking. I am very familiar with the woods and the animals that live there. I am also a firm believer in Bigfoot. I have read every book and article I can find on the subject. I have followed all the reports and sightings. I am convinced that Bigfoot is real and that they live in North America's woods. With that said, I will now relate my own personal Bigfoot encounter. It was early spring and my friends and I were camping near the river. We had been hiking and fishing all day and sat around the campfire enjoying a cold beer. It was getting dark and we started talking about turning in for the night. The river flowed slowly and calmly, and the woods were alive with the sounds of the animals that came out at night. It was a dark, moonless night. The only light came from the campfire and the stars. Through the trees we could see the lights from the houses on the other side of the river. As we were talking, we heard a loud, long howl. It was a high-pitched howl like a wolf, but much more prolonged and more deafening. It sounded like it came from the other side of the river. We all stopped talking and listened. The howl came again, this time sounding farther away. We listened for a few more minutes, but heard no more howls. None of us could place the sound. It didn't sound like any animal we had ever heard before. A few minutes passed when one of my friends tossed a piece of wood into the fire. He kept his 9mm close by his side, but talked in hushed tones about what we had just heard. We were both pretty unnerved by all of this and, after a time, decided to try to retire to our tents. However, retiring just meant lying there for an undisclosed amount of time. I couldn't tell you exactly when it was, but I was awoken by something hitting the side of my tent. I was lying at the back side of my tent and could tell something large and heavy had struck the side next to me. It sounded like a baseball hit the tent. I heard a massive crash and a tree coming down fast, not far from our campsite. At that point I remember saying, "Screw this," grabbed my sleeping bag and jolted out of my tent. My friend was already outside, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Without speaking, we both gave each other this mutual look that said, "Let's get out of here." And we did. We left our tents and other supplies that we could just return in the morning and grab. Luckily, we parked not too far away from where we were camping. The following afternoon, we came back and retrieved our stuff. It felt eerie, the entire spot where we had our tent set up, like we were being watched as we dismantled and packed up everything. We talked about it the following day. We were both pretty shaken up by the whole experience. We had no idea what could have caused the howling or the tree to come crashing down. We still don't know for sure what happened that night, but we both agree that it was a Bigfoot. Encounter 5, submitted by Thomas Bailey. Time, 1974. Location, Pennsylvania. I was spending the weekend with my mother at her home in the mountains of north-central Pennsylvania. It was the summer of 1974. I was 12 years old. My mother's house was near a large state forest. I was riding my bicycle along a dirt road in the woods when I came upon a large clearing. I stopped to rest and looked around when I noticed a large, dark figure moving about 100 yards away through the trees. I watched it for a few minutes, trying to figure out what it was. It was about 7 feet tall and covered with dark brown hair. It was walking upright, but it was not a man. I didn't see any clothing. I watched it for about 5 minutes and then it disappeared. I was so frightened that I ran home and told my mother. She didn't believe me and thought I was playing a joke on her. I never told anyone else about it. I've always wondered what I saw that day. I haven't seen anything like it since. I've spent many years researching. I have found that there are a lot of sightings in the Pennsylvania mountains. I have also found that there are a lot of strange sounds in the mountains of Pennsylvania. I have heard some of the sounds on YouTube. They sound similar to the sounds I have heard. As it turns out, my brother had an encounter in the mountains in the same region about 9 years after I did. My brother saw a Bigfoot in the early 1980s. He was camping with friends in the mountains. They were in a tent. He woke up in the middle of the night and saw a large, dark figure trying to get into his tent, and he fired several rounds off at this thing only to have it scream and run off. He said it was not a bear or a man. He said it was large and walked on two legs. He said it had a deep, guttural scream unlike anything he had heard. He said it was very frightening. He said it was about 3 a.m. and a full moon. He said he could see it very clearly. He said he didn't tell anyone about it for years. He was ridiculed and thought to be crazy. I believe him 100% and believe that what I saw was the same thing he saw. He and I grew up differently because he spent more time living with our father and I spent more time living with our mother. We spent a lot of time in the mountains and forests of Pennsylvania. We both know the mountains and forests very well. We both know what we saw and heard. I think there is something in the Pennsylvania mountains that is similar to the one seen in the Patterson film. I can't say for sure that it is Bigfoot, but I'll stand by my words that it wasn't a person or a bear. Encounter 6, submitted by Angelo. Time, 1970s, location, Florida. Many people have heard stories about Bigfoot. Well, in Florida, they call it the skunk ape. Why? Because whatever this creature is, it has a really nasty smell like a skunk, albeit different. So this story takes place in South Florida, West Hollywood to be more precise. West Hollywood is a small town that lies between Miami and Fort Lauderdale on the east coast of Florida. Although it happened many years ago, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was the middle of summer and unbearably hot and humid. The air was thick and heavy, like you could almost cut it with a knife. During the day, the sun would be beating down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. You could actually fry an egg on the sidewalks, forget going to the beach. The water was so warm it felt like a hot bath. Even the beach sand would burn your feet if you didn't wear shoes right to the water's edge. My cousin Gary had moved to a house that sat right in the middle of an orange grove, about 10 miles west of Hollywood. His house was surrounded by hundreds of acres of orange, grapefruit and tangelo trees. Beyond that was the Everglades swamp. It's full of gators, deer, snakes and all kinds of creepy crawly things. Some friends and I went to Gary's house on this particular night. There was Steve, Bill, Dallas, myself, Gary and his girlfriend just hanging out. We had heard on the news that the skunk ape had reportedly been seen close by in the Everglades, so, needless to say, we were armed just in case. We had a couple of pistols, a .38 Special, a .357 Magnum and a few hunting rifles. We were sitting on the front porch trying to stay cool because it was too warm to sit in the house. Gary didn't have air conditioning. All of a sudden an awful smell filled the air. If you ever smelled a skunk, you know how potent the air can get, and you can't escape the smell. Well, this was like that. Except the scent was different than a skunk, but just as nasty. It seemed to get stronger as we sat there deciding if we should go inside and try to avoid the odor. Then we heard something that sounded like heavy footsteps coming from the direction of the orange grove behind the house. Almost simultaneously, we all looked at each other and said, "Skunk ape." We ran into the house, and each of us grabbed a gun. Then Gary turned on the back door porch light. It was so dark, though, that the light only penetrated about 30 feet into the grove. Beyond that, total darkness. We all stood there looking out the back door, guns at the ready. None of us said a word. Then we heard what sounded like twigs snapping and leaves rustling as if something was coming closer. We all tensed up and gripped our guns tighter. The smell was so bad by now that it was making our eyes water. We stepped out of the house into the backyard very slowly. Then we heard what sounded like a tree branch crashing down to the ground just beyond the reach of the light. Then we saw it, the skunk ape. It was about 7 or 8 feet tall and covered in dark fur. Its long arms ended in sharp claws, and its face was long and narrow with glowing red eyes. Then it let out a blood-curdling scream that sounded like a woman being murdered. I felt scared and excited at the same time. My heart was pounding in my chest and my hands were shaking. I was afraid that the creature would hurt us, but I was also curious to see it up close. When it let out that chilling scream, I felt a wave of terror wash over me, but I didn't hesitate to open fire. I just wanted to get rid of the thing. So even though we were scared, we kept shooting until it ran away. We don't know if we hit it or not, but it ran off into the darkness, and even after it was gone, the smell lingered for days. Some days later, a news report mentioned that a farmer had found his horse dead, not far from where Gary lived. Supposedly something had ripped the horse's head right off its body. What beast has that kind of strength? But the story doesn't end there. A few weeks later, my brother and some of his friends were out in the Everglades hunting for deer when they found what looked like a made cave. And it had animal bones inside, and it stank awful. They even took pictures to prove to everyone what they found. They thought it was the skunk ape's cave. I genuinely believe that what we saw that night was the skunk ape. Encounter 7, submitted by Vilify009, time unknown, location unknown. I was camping one evening by a large lake all by myself. The night was beautiful, and it was a serene, quiet evening. All of a sudden it got freezing. I felt a presence walk up beside me but saw nothing. As the presence got closer, I could hear heavy breathing. I assumed it was a bear and turned on my flashlight to look around. I didn't see anything, but I could feel something. I could hear the breathing, but there was no sign of movement beside me. Entirely unnerved by this newfound experience, I sat up and decided it was time to retire to my tent. I quickly jumped into my tent, afraid of what I was experiencing. I stayed in my tent the rest of the night, holding a flashlight and a tiny pocket knife should anything happen. Attempting to calm myself, I distracted myself with thoughts of remembering camping trips as a child. Then I heard 2 loud screeches just outside my tent, and then nothing. Shortly after that, I started hearing these loud noises approaching my tent at night. They sounded large, whatever it was that I was hearing. I was panicking, thinking 2 huge men would come and kill me. The sounds would stop abruptly outside my tent, then walk away and return at another angle. Several times this went on. I could hear 3 separate footsteps and sounds. The whole encounter lasted for over 3 hours. It felt like an eternity. I felt like I was going crazy. I just wanted it to stop. They were all sorts of strange sounds and noises. Some were screams and growls, while the others were weird stomping noises. Then it went silent for a moment, and I heard what sounded like a large branch being ripped off a tree right by me. Then I listened to it getting kicked off into the forest. Now, not only was I scared because of what I was experiencing, but I felt like whatever this was trying to intimidate me and wanting to hurt me. Finally, it stopped, and I could not keep it together. I tried calling out for help, just hoping someone else was around, but I heard nothing but me. I felt as though I was utterly helpless and all alone. I knew I was doomed. This had been going on for hours now, and these things were coming back and forth around my campsite. They were constantly circling my tent, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was on edge like crazy. Finally, the noises eventually ceased for some time, and I wasn't sure what would happen. They could still be out there watching me, but I was not going to take any chances or risks. I figured staying put in my tent was the best course of action until sunrise. I waited the entire night in my tent, frozen in fear. Morning eventually came, and I had not slept at all. Thoroughly exhausted, I decided to hike my way out as soon as possible. Upon exiting my tent, the area around me was trashed. Huge branches were ripped off the large fir tree about 10 feet away from my tent. My supplies were thrown all over the campsite. Frightened but intrigued, I grabbed my stuff and hit the trail, looking for a clear spot where I could escape, because I couldn't precisely remember the section of trail where I had hiked in. I only had the salvageable backpack and my tent. Everything else was destroyed. Upon getting to my car more than a mile away, I opened my trunk to put my gear inside so I could drive away. At the time, I had no idea what had happened the night before, but right as I closed my trunk, I heard this horrific scream in the distance. It sounded like a man's yell, but deep and loud. It sounded like a massive set of lungs. I froze in place, listening for a few seconds. Then out of nowhere, these strange noises started sounding off all around me. I felt immediate danger, just like the night before, and I realized that my life would be in danger if I didn't get in my car at that very moment. Terrified, I jumped in my vehicle, locked all the doors and left as fast as I could, still hearing these noises echoing off in the distance. What did I hear the previous night? What did this all mean? I can only say that this experience left me completely overcome with fear, confusion and amazement. I've never had an experience like that before. It leaves me feeling shaken about how such a large creature could move about at night, surround a tent and scare someone without ever being seen. There are theories and explanations for what it could be, but I have my doubts about most of them. I just don't think everybody who has come up with a plausible answer is aware of how loud, intimidating and ferocious this thing is, whatever it is. That's all for now. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more and check out The Big Book of Monsters Volume 1 on Amazon.